Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. My name is Sean Firmage. I will be your host today for this webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to just mention the polls we have down at the bottom. We'd love to hear your input if you guys have any topics that you'd like to hear in the month of August. Go ahead and enter those down below. Also, we'd love to know how you heard about today's webinar. As an announcement, our next webinar will be tomorrow, Friday, July 14th at 3 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. It will be by Catherine Grant and is titled Fast, Easy, and Fun, Giving Indexing a Boost with Zoning. So that will be tomorrow. Today, we are pleased to have James Tanner with us, and he will be giving a presentation titled Understanding Naturalization for Genealogists. James has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law from Arizona State University. He worked for 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 35 years of experience in genealogical research and is a blogger for Genealogy Star and the blog Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He is the co-author or author of over 25 books on genealogical research and has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren. And we'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, James, for the presentation.
Howdy, this is James Tanner. Glad to be back for another BYU Family History Library webinar. I'd like to remind everyone that these webinars are being recorded and they will be uploaded to our Brigham Young University Family History Library YouTube channel, where we have, we're getting close to 300 videos up there right now. If you're looking at this after a period of time since it was recorded, you'll probably find a lot more. Also remember to subscribe. That helps you to get notice of the videos, and it helps us to get a little more recognition in the vast number of millions and millions of videos that are being uploaded onto YouTube. We're going to talk about understanding naturalization for genealogists. Recently did a webinar on immigration. And we sometimes talk about immigration and naturalization, but they're not exactly the same thing, and they are certainly don't necessarily go together in that sense directly. There are many people who come to the United States as immigrants who never go through the process of naturalization. So that's simply the one of the ways of cataloging and classifying this type of information. The definition of naturalization is pretty simple. It's the admittance of a foreigner to the citizenship of a country. So people can go to other countries and become as foreign nationals and become citizens of those countries. Every country has its own set of laws. This is a part of the type of sources that we refer to as genealogists. That's probably the most, one of the most legal intensive parts of what we talk about. There's other areas like tax law and things like that where generally all you're looking at is a list, but in naturalization you're dealing with a whole bunch of layers of considerations. The first layer, of course, being that of the immigrant himself or herself being admitted to the United States, and then the requirements at the time that the person enters the United States for that person to become a naturalized citizen, and the fact that those requirements have changed frequently over time. So there's and because of those changes for genealogists, where we have to find the information and the type of information that we're likely to find once we've gone through the process of looking for it and finding it has also changed considerably from the earliest dates of the country till the present. Um, and one of the most important things, though, that we know about naturalization is that they may, and this is a big may, it's not just, it doesn't something that happens every time, but it may open the door to identifying the immigrant. And this is a major reason why we would become involved with looking at these naturalization laws. Naturalization history. We're going to go back and see how that all came about in the United States. Now, as genealogists, we have a tendency to become a little bit nervous when we're confronted with the fact that genealogy is part of history, and that our people did not live in a vacuum, that they are not just name states that happen to live in certain places, but they are actual people who lived in and participated in the history of the countries where they lived. And if they came to the United States, they basically got here during the time period when whatever was going on here in the country became part of either the advantages that they took or the disadvantages and problems that they were faced with. First of all, we have to understand that naturalization, as far as the United States of America is concerned, originates with the United States Constitution. And the Constitution gives Congress, the legislature, the power to enact uniform rules of naturalization. That's an interesting gift of power by the Constitution to the Congress. And what that really has translated into is that, yes, they have uniform rules of naturalization, meaning everyone in the United States who comes to the United States is subject to the same rules, but they've managed to extend that to the fact that the rules right now, and have been for many, many years, are far, far from uniform. There's nothing uniform about naturalization. It's been very, very selective as far as who gets to be naturalized, who doesn't get to be naturalized, and how long it would take, and what they have to do it, and so forth and so on. So the uniform part has sort of been sidestepped by the Congress over the years. The second one is, to start out, we talk about 1790. That was the time of the ratification of the Constitution, and the people who were allowed to become citizens were free white persons with 2 years residency. It's going to be a little bit difficult here because we're going to have to talk about minorities and different racial mixtures, because that's basically the issue that occurs when you start out with anything having to do with the naturalization process, and you'll see how that's affected it. So back then, unless you were free and white, you simply just didn't become a resident. You didn't, and had been here for 2 years, you didn't become a citizen. And that was the earliest one. That was changed, by the way, and this is going to be the whole history of this thing, is that it was changed after a very few years. In 1995, the legislature passed the Naturalization Act. However, in the words of law, they codified, and that means they made formal the provision about people who are free, white, and they raised the time of residency to 5 years or more to become a citizen. Okay, so if you think about this, the reason why we would go through this and talk about it is that as your ancestors came to America, they're going to come in during one of these time periods. So if they were here during the British colonization, they were citizens of Great Britain, they were citizens of England or Great Britain, and they were automatically citizens when they came over from England. There was no change. Nobody was really an immigrant in that sense. They were just moving from one country to another, to the same country in a different place. But as we started the United States, then the United States became a separate country from England, from Great Britain. And so then, where were we? We were passing laws as to who could become a citizen of our new country. And so this was the first 2 stages. So if you were able to track back through whatever records were available when your immigrant arrives in the country, in the United States, in America, then depending on the law, you would have that much time to look for, at least you'd have to be there for at least that much time before they would ever have filed naturalization papers. So that's why these dates and considering these laws and the changes of the laws are pertinent to the concept of research. Because let's say my ancestor got here in 1794. Well, then the law changed in 1795 and said they had to be here for 5 years. And so they would have had to wait until 1799 before they could begin the process of naturalization. So you can see that the laws are going to impact it. Now, the question about the naturalization laws is whether or not they were retroactive, meaning did they apply to people that were already here in the country when they were passed? And the answer is generally yes, they were retroactive in the sense that anybody who was here who had not applied for citizenship then had to apply under the law that was current at the time that they were living in the country. So there was no question that they were going to have to listen to the newest law. 3 years later, they pass a new law. This is called the 1798 Naturalization Act, which is part of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay. Now, why were they worried about aliens and seditions? No, there were no flying saucers and there, or whatever. These were people who were coming into the country. And the reason here at 1798, if we go back into history, you realize that the conflict between, excuse me, the conflict between the colonists, between the Americans, who were now part of the United States of America, and the British, who were still around, by the way, and the French, who were still around, and their friends, the Indians, and the others people who were in the area, the Spanish, and the rest of the people from Europe who were trying to come into the country, were creating some problems with a lot of different political and social and cultural issues by this time. And so the Naturalization of Alien and Sedition Acts were basically targeting two different categories of people, Irish and French immigrants, and they raised the requirement for residency to 14 years. Now, why was this happening? Well, it's very simple. The word is vote. These people would come in large numbers and they would vote. And because they had a common background, they would almost always vote as a block. They would vote in one way. And that was not necessarily the way that the people who are already here in the United States wanted things to run. And so they viewed these people as being undesirable in a lot of different ways. And so they didn't want them to be residents. They didn't want them to be citizens and be naturalized and be able to vote because they wanted to preserve their own voting blocks. Okay, very simple. It's been going on since the 1700s. Actually, it's been going on since probably back as soon as anybody figured out that someone was new and they had something to protect against somebody who was new. So it goes back into prehistory likely. But anyway, we have the 1798 Alien and Sedition Acts, and the residency requirement was raised to 14 years. So what about the person who showed up in the United States? Now this person who showed up in 1790, who hasn't applied for citizenship, and now they're looking in 1798. Now what do they have to do? Well, they have to have been there for 14 years before they will allow them to become a naturalized citizen. Okay, so every time that happens, by the way, and just to remind us as genealogists, we've got to remember that we have a greater time period to look for records. As we can't assume that we look for a few years after a person arrived and decide that they never made an application for citizenship. I've run across people, by the way, who arrived in the mid 1800s, got here in the United States in 1860s or earlier, and didn't apply for citizenship until 1920 or 25. They were like 80 years old or 90 years old, and then they decided it was time to become a citizen. So naturalization is one of those things that could occur anytime during the person's life. And so the limitation on looking for the records is something that we need to consider carefully. Okay, so now we're going to look at subsequent acts. And the Naturalization Act of 1798 was repealed in 1802, so it didn't last very long. Now, why was it repealed? Well, because there were enough French and Irish to have political effect, and they didn't like it. And so, and there were other immigrants coming in, and they said, "Oh no, we're not gonna have that." So they repealed it, and they waited around for a while. Now, when they repeal an act, what happens? Well, that's an interesting question, and it always gets thrown back into the courts because of that kind of situation. But if they repeal the act, they can repeal the act and say that they are going to re-implement the existing law at the time that the repealed act was passed, or they simply can repeal the act and leave the question of the time and everything else for naturalization to be determined by the courts. So now, a citizen, if you were coming to the United States in 1803, you would be wondering how long it was going to take you to become a citizen of the United States, and probably you would hear people saying, "Oh no, you've got to be here for 14 years," and even though the law has been repealed, we're still going to wait 14 years. And then there would be others that would say, "Oh no, it's only 2 years, and it's gone back to the old law." And then there's others that say, "No, it's longer periods of time." So then you would go to court, and eventually the United States Supreme Court, if it did, would determine that fact. But the interesting thing about naturalization law is that they pass so many new laws and change the law every time that I doubt that the courts ever had time to really get into the act and decide how much time period everybody had for naturalization. And the other part of it, of course, is the immigrants who would worry about naturalization were generally not wealthy enough to fight the battle through the court system to the Supreme Court, so they just worked and ignored the fact and then applied whenever they were allowed to. Again, in 1819, now what happened between 1802 and 1819? Relationship between the United States and Britain were pretty much in disarray, and we fought a war that we now refer to as the War of 1812. And eventually, we look at it that we won, Britain looks at it that they didn't lose, and so we don't really know how that one went, but we have this war back in 1812, and we have 1819, another law being passed reporting immigration and rules for passengers bound for Europe. Now we're worried about people that are leaving the country. And we're realizing that there are such things as spies, and there are such things as subterfuge, and all sorts of things. So they're going back and forth. You have to remember also that during this time period, the United States was basically plastered along the eastern seaboard. We had the colonies in the east, and we think of the United States now stretching from the east coast to California and Oregon and Washington. But in those days, it ended at the Appalachian Mountains. There was hardly anybody that had crossed the mountains at that point, except a few explorers and Indians and a few British troops and such. So we're really looking at as a strip of people living along the coast who most of their contact with the world was with Europe. And so by 1819, there was an awareness that we need to start controlling who's coming in and who's going out, and why are they coming in and why are they going out. So that was kind of the idea there. And just the year afterwards, in 1820, the United States established a centralized point for immigration. It was called Castle Garden. And if perhaps you're familiar with Manhattan Island, but if you're not familiar with New York, at least it's an island. And it runs roughly north and south. And at the south end of the island was a park called Battery Park, but they turned that into an immigration center called Castle Garden. and they had buildings and everything, and we'll look at that in a second. We'll come back to Castle Garden because it's one of the places where we go to get the most information about immigration, one of the 2 or 3 places where we get that. Now, we understand up until this point that we've talked about free white people as being naturalized citizens of the country, and that hadn't changed at all yet. Um, the problem, of course, was the term white, and that was still a sticking point and politically. And we have what we call the infamous Dred Scott case. Poor Dred Scott. If you read about him, he didn't live a very happy life. But Dred Scott was a freed slave, and as such, he attempted to become a citizen of the United States because they weren't. Slaves were not citizens. Essentially, if you want to think of it in very, very simplistic terms, being a citizen means you have a right to vote. If you're not a citizen, you can't vote. And that's the basic concept there. So basically in 1857, leading up to the Civil War, the Supreme Court of the United States decided the Dred Scott case and ruled that freed slaves were not citizens of the United States. Now, part of that was coming from the fact that the definition of a citizen in the United States involved being born in the United States. Not that you were carried here by your parents or that you came here as an immigrant, but that you were born on the U.S. soil. Well, some of them actually were, but most of them were born in houses and stuff like that. But anyway, you had to be born here, and the slaves, of course, were born here. Dred Scott was born in the United States, and he was a free person. He was not a slave, and yet they ruled that because he had been a slave, then he was not a citizen of the United States, even though he had been born in the United States. That was a terrible decision. Now, part of the reason this decision is remembered is that because it was one of the major contributors to the conflict that ended up being the Civil War. This was one of the breaking points that occurred between the people who were anti-slavery and the people who were pro-slavery, or at least didn't care about slavery. Okay, so next we have a next big step that occurred was during the Civil War. And one of the problems that they had in getting people to fight in the Civil War was that those who had enough money didn't fight because they were rich enough to buy their way out. In other words, if you were drafted into the Army back in the Civil War days, you could post a bond, or you could hire somebody else to go in your place. So there were plenty of people who were interested in being hired to go fight in the war. Why? Because they were poor immigrants and they didn't have anything else to do, and they were starving to death. So they were basically hired to fight the war. And these people who were hired to fight the Civil War, when they got out of the war, they wanted to, they were feeling like they should be, since they fought the war, that they should be citizens of the United States. Nice, really good idea, I suppose. If you were living back then, that was a pretty attractive idea. And so they passed a law in the United States, and this is in the United States part, not the Confederacy, so we're talking about the Union. But the United States legislature passed a law in 1862 that Army veterans could file without a declaration of intent. This is a document we'll talk about in just a minute. And after 1 year of residence in the United States. So basically, these guys who signed up to fight for a year could just become citizens. All they had to do was say, I was a soldier in the Army, I fought for 1 year, and when they get out of the Army after a year, they can walk into the court and say, I want to be a citizen, and they were sworn in as citizens. They didn't have to say anything, they didn't have to file any documents, they didn't have to do anything. So it was one of the benefits, if you will, of being in the Army. I don't really know how many soldiers went out and fought in the war because of the fact that they could get citizenship, but it was a reasonable thing to do. And now we have 1868. The war is over. we have a lot of things still residual problems hanging around out there in with the law, and we're talking about the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment said, and here it is, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Okay, there's a lot of stuff in this, folks, and this goes into a huge area of the United States law. One of the areas that I was involved in as an attorney over the years had a lot to do with, occasionally, not a whole lot, but occasionally had to do with constitutional law provisions. And the keywords here are the fact that, number one, everybody that was born or naturalized was a citizen. And that clarified Dred Scott. In other words, it reversed the Supreme Court ruling in Dred Scott. It made all of the slaves who had been born here, who were now freed as of 1868, citizens of the United States. And then the other keywords here are privileges or immunities of citizens and due process and equal protection. These are all the big buzzwords of our law. And this is really the key amendment to the U.S. Constitution as far as the enforcement of laws, and it affects directly the idea of naturalization. But we'll see that didn't work too well, as we'll see in the future. Okay, and one of the things about doing research in naturalization and using the court records and other things that are necessary to find the naturalization records is to expect complication. There's nothing simple about naturalization, and there is nothing simple about the law, and there is really nothing simple about any of this. And this is one of the challenging areas, unfortunately. But fortunately, when we have a very challenging area of research, we usually have greater benefits from that. So we get greater benefits the more complicated, more difficult the area is. It's very much more likely that no one else has dug into it and found the information. And when we do, we may very well unravel mysteries and problems that have been intractable for years in facing families who have been doing research. So these are some of the areas that untangle the tangled. And you have to start by tangling it all up, though. And that's part of the complication of the law. We're still back to history. You'll remember we left it off in 1868, so we're going to jump ahead to 1875. And that's where we have Henderson versus the mayor of New York. And even notwithstanding what you would think would be the clear language of the 14th Amendment, the states said, no, forget it. We're still passing our own laws. We don't particularly care for these particular types of people coming into our state, so we're going to pass laws that say they can't immigrate, and we're going to pass further laws that says they can't vote because we don't want them voting and taking us out of office because we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. Okay, so here we have a Supreme Court case that declared all the state laws governing immigration unconstitutional. So nobody passed, the states from 1875 forward could not pass immigration laws. They had no, and naturalization laws. So they really had no control over anything having to do with the process at that point. Now, we're getting into a time period when you can expect that many of your ancestors came to the United States. More than 5.2 million immigrants entered the U.S. between 1880 and 1890. And we think we have a big flood of immigrants coming in now. These were mostly immigrants, and they were almost, well, the vast majority of these people were coming in through two places, either in through New York or through Boston, with a few in Philadelphia and then in other parts the country, but we had millions of people coming into the country. Now, if you think about it, you'll say, well, why is New York the largest city in the United States? And then if you go back to 1880, you'll say, where did those 5.2 billion people go? Well, they only got as far as New York and they never came out of it. So that's why we have this huge, huge city of New York sitting on the East Coast. Now, by 1882, by the way, even though there were all these immigrants piling in, we passed what was called the first Immigration Act. Before 1882, anybody who could walk or get a boat ticket or come across a border, be carried into the country in any way, could become an immigrant. There was really no control over who came to the United States. Period. End of story. You just came here. That's why, the poem from the Statue of Liberty, "Give me your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free." That was before 1882, by the way, not after 1882. That was the poor were coming in before that. After that, it was a little more difficult and complicated. But this was the first act. It was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it suspended Chinese immigration for 10 years and barred Chinese from U.S. citizenship. And they also imposed a head tax. Now, head tax is basically a tax on being a person. If you were a person, you had a head tax. And if you came into the country, you were taxed. And it barred convicts, lunatics, and others unable to care for themselves. Well, who determined that? Whoever. Whatever the immigration officer was, if he looked at you and thought you were a lunatic, you were gone, folks. You didn't make it. So, this is where the law became very exclusionary, and a little bit kind of, this is where I said that it started not to be exactly follow up with what you would call the 14th Amendment. Okay. Then in 1888, this was the first time that aliens were deported from the United States. The first aliens were picked up and shipped out of the country. So that was the earliest that if you're going back in time, you understand that people came across the border without any control. And now in 1888, they're starting to pick them up and ship them back to where they came from. Now, why this reflects the condition of the world in Europe at that time, primarily, not the rest of the world. They weren't so worried about Latin America or other places, Africa or any place else. The slave trade had ended. The people that were here. The people that were, whatever. But they began the process of picking and choosing which of the governmental entities in Europe they wanted to support and who was politically acceptable and who wasn't. And so they decided that they could actually get rid of people by sitting them on boats and sending them back where they came from. And so in 1891, we have the Bureau of Immigration. Now, why is this important? Let me go back to the concept here that we're talking about as genealogists. Every time I talk about an act, every time that I mention one of these historical facts, we can assume that there are records being created that will help to identify our ancestors as a result of the changes in the law. And so we're looking at different laws that create different bureaucratic issues that create documents that we can use to search for our ancestors. And the fact that we don't know they exist, or the fact that we never heard of naturalization, or that we don't even know where to start to look, that's why we have to learn about this stuff in order to do a more effective research as genealogists. We really need to know some of this historical background. In fact, we need to know a lot of historical background about the places where our ancestors lived so that we can understand what kinds of records may have been created and have any clue at all at what we need to look at to learn about finding these people. So now we have the Bureau of Immigration established, and obviously if there's a Bureau of Immigration, they've got a lot of documents, and if they've got a lot of documents, they're going to keep a lot of records, and these records are going to go someplace, and where are they going to go? They're all going to go to the National Archives. So all of these records, beginning in 1891, are in the National Archives. So In 1891, they also started listing more different kinds of people they didn't like, and they also implemented a law that said that they could order a steamship company to return the immigrants if they didn't like them. So you could struggle across Europe, get on a boat, come to America, get to America, and they could look at you and say, "We don't want you," and they could force the steamship company to haul you back to Europe. So what are you going to do when you get back to Europe? Die. That's about all they had. So this is not an inconsequential law. So if you're wondering whatever happened to your immigrant ancestors, they may have gotten caught in some of these problems as they came to America. And in 1892, 1 year later, they opened Ellis Island. Uh, Basically, the reason was that uh, the real estate at the tip of Manhattan Island was becoming very, very, very valuable. I mean, let's get it. That's where the World Trade Center was. That's where the new World Trade Center has been built. There's all sorts of things there, and they didn't need a bunch of immigrants coming into the country, sitting there and coming into to lower Manhattan. So they shipped it off onto an island, which, by the way, didn't really exist as much. They kind of built the island. They went out and dumped all their garbage out there, and they filled it in until they had an island and built an island out there. So it was, I think there was something there to start with, but they improved on it quite a bit. And so they built Ellis Island out there, and a woman traveling alone had to be met by a man. In other words, somebody here had to meet them at the border, or they just got put back on the boat and sent back. So somebody had to be here. So if you think about that from your genealogical standpoint, and you find that you have a woman coming across, you have to find, after 1892, you'll have to find out who met her when she got off the boat. Because if there wasn't anybody to meet her when she got off the boat, she went back. Okay, so here you go, and gives you start some. If you think about some of these things and you start to realize what's going on here, you'll begin to realize that there really, really are some really interesting things about the law that might determine what happened to these people and why they didn't turn out the way you thought they did. But if you're looking for genealogy, you have to wonder who was here, who met these people, and where did they go? And how did they get into the country? Okay, so there's all this kind of stuff. Um, I have to admit that this whole process is law intensive. I mean, it really is very, very law intensive, and understanding and applying the various changes in the law can change the way that your people, where you find the records for these people. And this desert scene that I have here is indicative of what I think about trying to get anything out of. We have a statement in law that you can't get blood out of a turnip. And That's an interesting one. The idea that turnip hasn't got any blood. Well, obviously turnips don't have blood, but the people that we're referring to as turnips are usually deadbeats that can't pay their debts. But the idea here with immigration is that immigration became very, very, very selective after the 1890s. This is where there's a run up in all of the empires in Europe. You have to understand that the German Empire was growing. They had wars going on. There was a balance of power in Europe that was extremely precarious, run up to World War I. And the United States was becoming very nervous about foreigners and about people who are coming to America. We've got all sorts of problems there. And law is really dry, really dry. It's really sometimes very hard to understand. I can remember sitting in law school studying for exams and reading a case and realizing by the time I was at the bottom of the page that I was sound asleep, and going up to the top of the page and rereading the case and then getting to the bottom and realizing I'd been sound asleep and I still haven't figured it out. And I would go through that quite a few times before I could get through the case. So yeah, we're back to more history. 1902, They decided to extend the Chinese Exclusion Act, and so we have more time to try to keep the Chinese out of America. In 1903, we're getting close to the war, the big war, the war to end all wars, World War I. It didn't work, obviously. And we have anarchists, epileptics, polygamists, beggars are not admitted to the United States. And so I don't know how they figure out which category you fall in, but they had a way of telling if you were a beggar, I guess. I don't know. I don't figure that one out. But polygamists, I guess, if you told them, you'd probably have to leave. And epileptics, that's another one. And how do they know you were an anarchist? I don't know that one either, but that was one of the criteria that you were. 1905, they decided to do the same thing that they'd done on the East Coast on the West Coast. So they built Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco Bay, and the whole idea there was to exclude Chinese immigrants. So they were trying to keep the yellow horde, as they called it, out of the United States, and they were afraid that the Chinese were going to overrun the whole country. So they basically banned all of these people from coming. I don't know where you get the idea of equal protection and due process and all that, but this is what they were doing. And in 1906, they added English as a requirement for immigration. So after 1906, if you came to the United States, you had to speak English, or at least enough English to be understood, because they wouldn't let you in the country otherwise. And in 1907, this is all running up to World War I, by the way, so you can see how it worked. 1907, a head tax was raised and additional limitations on immigration. In 1917, right before the war, they imposed a literacy test for all immigrants over 16, and Asiatic barred zone was created, preventing all immigrants from Asia. So they not only were not going to let in Chinese, they weren't going to let anybody who came from Asian. So nobody from Japan, Indonesia, any place could get into the United States after 1917. In 1921, now the war's been fought, and we got out of it finally. Then they began imposing nationality quotas on limiting immigrants to 3% of each nationality present in the United States in 1910. So there was concern beginning at this point in time, and that's 1920. So you're getting into the time period where either some of us, some of our parents, or at least most of our grandparents, those of us who are older, were living in the United States when they started these policies of limitation. And then in 1922, Japanese were made ineligible for citizenship per se. If you were Japanese, you could not be a citizen of the United States. And so this is interesting. Okay, now in the middle of that, we have to go back and look at another part of this, and that is that all along, of course, we have those who were descendants of the African slaves who were brought to the United States, a sizable black community. And then we have people who were living here at the time when the English and the Spanish and the French and everybody got here, and those people we call Native Americans. Indians, and they were not citizens of the United States, notwithstanding the 14th Amendment, notwithstanding the fact that they were born here and had been born here forever. They were not citizens. And it wasn't until 1924, interestingly enough, if you don't know this, it can sometimes be very surprising, that Indians were not citizens of the United States until 1924. They could not vote. So now we have the Indians voting, and then we have a 1940 Nationality Act made citizens of all born on U.S. soil. So once again, we decided to say what we had said back in 1868 in the 14th Amendment, and we said that everybody who was born here could become a citizen, was a citizen. In 52, we had the Immigration and Nationality Act. It eliminated race as a bar to immigration or citizenship. So everything that they'd said about Japanese, Asians, Chinese, and everybody else uh, was thrown out in 1952. In 2001, we have the Patriot Act, and that created a complicated structure for immigration and naturalization, believe me. That is where all the complications started. At one point in time, I wanted to go into naturalization, immigration naturalization law, and I was serious. And so I went in, since I spoke Spanish fluently and still do, I had decided that that would be an interesting area to get into. I got all the books, all of the law books on everything on the subject. This is long after I was already practicing law, so it wasn't like I was doing this before I was a lawyer. But I took all the law books and talked about it, and then talked to the immigration lawyers about what their practice was and how it was. And the immigration lawyers were basically told me this. They said, well, every day we get up and we look at the computer and we look at the laws, and every day there's a different quota and there's a different set of rules and regulations for who's going to get in this day and who isn't, and it changes like the stock market or the tax law. You have to know this every day. You have to know. So they're changing it like constantly. And so and I just decided, well, I don't like tax law for that reason, so I'm obviously not going to buy another area where I'd have to look at the law every day to figure out what I was doing. And so that was how I got into real estate. Okay, so let's kind of go back and give some general ideas here. Pre-1790 naturalization, all British citizens were automatically citizens in the colonies. We didn't have to worry about naturalization. Nobody had to become a citizen, they already were. Next, we're going to 1789 to 1882, big groups. Okay, we've gone through all the details of all the changes in the law, but now we're talking about big chunks of people. So 1789 to 1882, we have very few restrictions on immigration. Everybody who got on a boat usually could get off the boat, walk into the country, and have no problems at all. Everybody was here. Once they'd been here for the time period that applied, they could apply for citizenship and they became citizens, and there were just literally millions of people who became citizens of the United States. And there were very few restrictions on naturalization. There were almost none until 1882. Now, what's the general naturalization process? It's change. So whatever day you happen to apply is the day that you have to know what the rules are. So you go out and you look at it. So the rules of naturalization changed regularly from 1782, it should be 1882, to the present. Okay. And some interesting facts. Oh, well, actually, they changed regularly from 1792 and 1792 to the present also. I mean, we've already seen that. But they changed more regularly after 1882. Some interesting facts. Residency requirements went from 2 years to 14 years and finally back to 5 years. So that's where we are today, unless they change it sometime in the near future. Oaths of allegiance were required. You had to swear allegiance to the United States of America and renounce any allegiance to your country of origin. And from 1855 to 1922, women received derivative naturalization through their husbands. So if the husband became a naturalized citizen, then the wife was automatically a naturalized citizen. And from 1907 onward, a woman who was a U.S. citizen lost her citizenship if she married an alien. Okay, I've got a couple of typos I've got to correct here. So in 1922, a woman no longer lost her citizenship by marrying an alien unless he could not become a citizen. So they changed the law again. And then in 1940, all aliens entering the United States had to be fingerprinted and have a visa. So it wasn't until 1940. And most of us can now remember that we were able to travel into Canada and Mexico with simply a visa, meaning you just got a permit as you go across the border and you could go into Canada and Mexico. Now we have to have passports to get across, go across the border into Canada or into Mexico. So things change. In 1952, all applications for naturalization began to be investigated. So then they created this giant investigation bureau out there. And in 1990, the courts no longer could confer citizenship. The power was given to the attorney general. So we don't have the courts. They swear them in, but they don't really uh, have any power over it. They're not the ones who decide who becomes a naturalized citizen or not. Where are the records? So here's the question of the day. Before 1906, the naturalization process took place in the local state courts, primarily. Could be a district court, a federal court, but any of the courts of record in the United States, meaning any court that kept a record of their decisions and published their decisions, was eligible to create citizenship up through 1906. 1906 is the watershed, because after 1906, all the records are federal records. Everything that has to do with naturalization is a federal record. Okay, so before 1906, if your person shows on the census record that they got NA, naturalization, then what you're going to do is look in the state court where they lived or someplace nearby to try and find the record of their naturalization in the United States. If after 1906 there's more records, but they are all located in the federal courts, and they all end up in various branches and various parts of the country depending on where the records have been stored and shipped in the National Archives branches around the country or in Washington, D.C. So they're primarily held in the National Archive branch where the naturalization occurred. So here is where you have to get into understanding that there are branches of the National Archives, where those branches were and what the jurisdiction of the branches were at the time that your immigrant entered the United States, and then determine whether or not they have the records and go to the archive branch and search for the records. Now, here's what they look like. Here's all the different kinds of records. So now we're looking at this. This is the oath of intention to become a citizen. So it's called a Declaration of Intent, and it was a prerequisite for many years. And you'll recall that they waived the Declaration for Intent of the soldiers that fought during the Civil War. So then we have the naturalization record. This is a record of the naturalization, and they're very disappointing, by the way. I'm sorry, but that's the way it works. For instance, I have an ancestor that came over from Ireland, and I had been looking for something about naturalization, and I thought I'd track it down, and I went to the National Archives physically, went to the National Archives in Philadelphia where they lived, and they said, probably we don't have the records. They're probably in the archives of the city of Philadelphia. So we went to the archives of the city of Philadelphia, and then we asked about the records, and they said, yeah, we have them, by the way. And so we stood around for a while until they dug them out, and then they brought out the record copy, and we had a look at it, and all it said was this person came from Ireland and is now a citizen, and that was not helpful at all. We already knew that they came from Ireland. So, but you never know. There might be more information on the petition than was available at that one. And then you have a certificate of citizenship, which was issued. Now, why are these other reason why these might be important and why we think about them is you might have 500 people who come from Europe whose names are exactly the same. And you're going to have to track down which of these 500 people that came from Europe were your ancestor. One of the ways you're going to differentiate between these people is by tracing their citizenship and their naturalization, because you'll know when they got here, and you can start looking for passenger lists, and you're going to be able to do tracing back and finding more information about the immigrant, finally might identify this person from the mass of people who had that same name who came from Ireland or England or from Italy or from Germany or from Scandinavia. How many Jens Jensens from from Norway can we get, or from Denmark? Well, we're going to have to figure them out somehow, and that's done by looking at the naturalization records. Passports, that's a whole different area of the law, the passport law, and you need to get into that and learn a little bit of history on passports. But yes, that's another way of looking for information. And here are the places to look. There's the National Archives, has a section on naturalization records, and it's very interesting and goes into the same kind of detail that I just did, in order to understand the changes and where the law and where the records might have ended up and what kinds of records and who was required to file records and whatever in the United States. And you can order copies of the naturalization records online from the National Archives. So if you can find them in the indexes, or send an inquiry to the National Archives and pay the fee, and they will do the search and come back and send you the documents if they find the documents. And fortunately, some of these records, some of the naturalization records, are available on the large genealogy websites like Family Search and Ancestry and some of the other places. You're really going to have to dig for these records in a lot of places, particularly in courts and the court records. Okay, well, that's sort of an overview of naturalization. I realize it was law intensive, but when we basically gets to the point of understanding some of the processes that were involved here and the politics and the history, then we are more likely to find those records that we need to, that will help us to identify our ancestors and bridge the gap of them coming from Europe or from wherever they came to the United States. Thanks for watching. Remind everyone that these webinars are recorded and uploaded to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. That's YOUTUBE channel. And we would encourage you to subscribe. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, James. We'd also like to thank all those who are in attendance today. And like he said, we will have this presentation posted up on YouTube later today. And one final reminder, our next webinar will be with Catherine Grant tomorrow, Friday, July 14th at 3 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. And we hope to see you then tomorrow.